Sometimes keeping your word to one side means breaking it to another. Thaddeus Bear Mallister had learned that lesson the hard way once, when he made peace between settlers and the Comanche, and now again with blood staining his shirt and war drums echoing in his ears. 6 months ago, Bear's Ranch had become sacred ground, neutral territory agreed upon by both the U.S. Cavalry and Chief White Bull. It was a rare accord, one that brought fragile peace to a land soaked in generations of mistrust and bloodshed. For half a year that peace held. No raids, no skirmishes, no mourning songs in the wind. Just the quiet kind of life a man could grow old with raising cattle, splitting firewood, and trying to believe that peace could last. But in Texas, peace was always as thin as morning frost. That October morning began like any other. Bear was chopping firewood behind his cabin, sweat already clinging to his shirt despite the autumn chill. Then gunshots, not far. 3 cracks, then silence, then 2 more. Bear froze. That wasn't hunting. That was trouble, and it was coming fast from Devil's Canyon just 2 miles north. He dropped the axe and listened. Hoof beats. Not steady, like a patrol or a rider on routine. No, these were uneven, panicked. A horse being pushed too hard, a man running for his life. Then he saw the rider break through the canyon, mouth a young Comanche warrior hunched low over an exhausted paint horse, blood darkening his shirt, his body swaying like it might fall any second. Bear's gut turned cold. He recognized the boy Swift Eagle, the 19-year-old son of Running Wolf, one of Chief White Bull's most trusted warriors. The same boy who had come to Bear's Ranch months ago as part of a peaceful trading party. Quiet, curious, eager to learn the white man's way of working the land. Now he looked like death itself had found his trail. The horse collapsed just inside Bear's fence, gasping in the dirt. Swift Eagle tumbled from the saddle, trying to rise, but his legs folded under him. Blood soaked his shoulder and thigh. Bear ran to him, but the boy's hand shot to his knife. His eyes were wild, scared, filled with pain and warning. He muttered something in Comanche voice, sharp and desperate. Bear couldn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. "Easy, son," Bear said, raising his hand slowly. "I'm not gonna hurt you." Recognition flickered in Swift Eagle's eyes. He coughed, blood staining his lips. "Soldiers, they come," he said, struggling with English. "You cannot help me." From over the ridge, the sound of pursuing horses grew louder. 5 minutes, maybe less. Bear could hear the metallic jingle of bridles, boots pounding. Dirt shouted orders the cavalry. "Why are they chasing you?" Bear asked, crouching beside the boy. But Swift Eagle's head lolled to the side, unconscious. The blood loss too great. Bear glanced toward the canyon. They were almost here, and that's when the impossible decision stared Bear straight in the face. According to the treaty he helped broker, his land was neutral. No side Comanche or settler could bring violence here. If he helped Swift Eagle, he'd be harboring a fugitive, possibly even a murderer. If he turned him in, he'd be betraying White Bull's people, and worse, sending a wounded boy to certain death. Swift Eagle's eyes fluttered open again. His hand gripped Bear's shirt, trembling. "If you help me live," he whispered, "you break sacred law. My father, he must kill you." Bear's blood ran cold, but some choices don't offer safe outcomes, only consequences. As the cavalry closed in, Bear made the only decision his conscience would allow. He lifted Swift Eagle into his arms, the boy's blood soaking through both their shirts, and ran for the cabin. Behind him, the hoofbeats thundered louder. The peace Bear had fought to build was about to break, and he knew this time there would be no fixing it without a fight. The cavalry was less than 5 minutes away, their thunderous approach growing louder with each breath Bear took. He burst through the front door of his cabin carrying Swift Eagle's limp body in his arms. Blood soaked through the young man's shirt, and Bear could already feel it seeping into his own. Every heartbeat felt like a countdown. He moved swiftly, laying Swift Eagle on the bed in the back room, ripping off his own flannel shirt to use as makeshift bandages. The wounds were bad, one bullet through the shoulder, another buried deep in the thigh. Both were still bleeding. Bear grabbed a bottle of whiskey from his shelf and poured it over the wounds. Swift Eagle didn't even flinch. He was too far gone to feel it. The knock came faster than expected, loud, sharp, and backed by authority. "Open up." "This is Lieutenant Marcus Steele of the United States Cavalry." Bear wiped his hands quickly, ran a damp rag over his face, and opened the door. Steele stood tall and cold on Bear's porch, flanked by 2 mounted soldiers and several more fanned out behind. His hand rested casually on the grip of his revolver. The way he scanned Bear's face, he wasn't looking for hospitality. He was hunting a lie. "We're pursuing a Comanche warrior," Steele said flatly. "He killed 2 of my men this morning near Devil's Canyon. Witnesses say he came this way." Bear kept his face calm, his arms folded to hide the bloodstains. "I heard shots an hour ago," he said, voice even. "Sounded like trouble. Figured it wasn't my business." "It is now," Steele said, stepping closer. "We lost his trail near your land. You mind if we look around?" Every cell in Bear's body screamed no, but saying that would guarantee they'd know he was hiding something. He forced himself to nod. "Of course," he said. "Just keep in mind this ranch is neutral ground. By treaty." Steele's lip curled. "My orders come from Colonel Harrison, not from any Indian chief." He turned and waved to his men. "Search the property. Every building." Bear's pulse quickened. Swift Eagle was unconscious, bleeding out on his bed just 30 feet away. Lieutenant Bear tried what exactly happened out there. Steele's eyes narrowed. He and 2 others attacked a supply wagon headed for the reservation. Medicine, food for Comanche children. He killed 2 escorts. Bear felt the words hit like a punch to the ribs. Swift Eagle, a murderer. That didn't match the respectful, quiet young man he'd met just months ago, the boy who asked about irrigation and stayed behind to learn how to plow a straight row. And then Bear saw it, one of the soldiers holding up a leather pouch blood-stained, beaded in the Comanche style. But Bear recognized the pattern. It didn't match any beadwork from White Bull's people. Too bright, too uniform, not handmade. Steele's voice snapped Bear back. That pouch was found on one of the dead soldiers. Personal effects. The savage took it as a trophy. "That's not their way," Bear said mostly to himself. "Comanche warriors don't take photos and letters. They take weapons, horses." Steele stepped closer, voice low and dangerous. "Are you calling me a liar?" "I'm saying something's off," Bear replied carefully. "The pattern on that pouch isn't White Bull's tribe." Before Steele could respond, a soldier shouted from inside the cabin. "Lieutenant, we found something." Bear's stomach dropped. They'd found the bloodied shirt, the one he'd cut off Swift Eagle to treat his wounds. Moments later, the soldier emerged holding it up. "Still wet, sir. Looks like someone was doctoring wounds." Steele turned to Bear, a slow smile spreading on his face. Well, Mr. Mallister, seems neutrality doesn't mean much after all." The soldiers surrounded Bear in a loose half-circle, their rifles casual but ready. "You've got one chance," Steele said coldly. "Where is he?" Bear met the lieutenant's eyes. I don't know what you're talking about." Steele motioned to the cabin. "Search again. This time, check under everything." Bear knew then that hiding was no longer enough. If the soldiers moved the bed, they'd find Swift Eagle. And if they did, it would all be over, no trial, no mercy, just bullets. But then, a sound. Low, distant, primal. Drums. Steele froze. The soldiers stopped moving. War drums. One rhythm, then two, then a third. Echoing from the hills, from the east, from the south. Bear's breath caught. The Comanche were coming. Not a raid, not a rescue, a war party. And they were riding straight for Bear's ranch. Dust coiled in the air as 10 cavalry horses thundered into Bear Mallister's yard, their riders fanning out with mechanical precision. Their blue coats caught the early sunlight like blades, and their rifles weren't slung casually anymore, they were ready. At the head of the formation rode Lieutenant Marcus Steele, a lean man with the sharp posture of a career soldier and the cold eyes of someone who'd long since made peace with bloodshed. He dismounted, slowly adjusting the revolver on his hip as he surveyed the cabin like a predator sniffing the wind. Inside that cabin, just behind a shut bedroom door, Swift Eagle bled slowly into the sheets. Bear stepped outside to meet them, calm on the outside, but inside his heart pounded like the war drums echoing faintly from the distant hills. Afternoon, Mr. Mallister Steele said, his voice deceptively polite. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion." "You brought an army," Bear said flatly. "Just a patrol." Steele replied, though the formation looked like they were preparing for a siege. "We're tracking a fugitive Comanche warrior suspected of murdering 2 soldiers and stealing government supplies. Word is he was headed this way." "Lots of people head this way," Bear said evenly. "That doesn't mean I invite them in." Steele stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "I've got a witness," he said, "a rancher from the other side of Devil's Canyon. Claims he saw a young Comanche riding hard in this direction. Says he was bleeding. I've been chopping wood all morning," Bear said. "Haven't seen a soul." Steele didn't blink. "Then you won't mind if we take a look around." The words hit like a hammer. Bear felt the walls closing in. He couldn't stop them without giving himself away. But if they searched thoroughly, they'd find Swift Eagle barely clinging to life in the back room. Still, Bear forced himself to nod. "Search the barn, the smokehouse. You won't find anything. Start with the barn," Steele ordered. The soldiers scattered, moving quickly, boots crunching over dry dirt, rifles in hand. Bear could see the tension in them. Trained, but nervous. They'd heard the drums, too. Steele didn't move. He kept his pale eyes on Bear. "You sure you haven't seen anything suspicious today?" Bear held his gaze. "Depends what you mean by suspicious. Around here, peace is suspicious." Steele smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You know, Mr. Mallister, neutrality is a convenient word. But when men are murdered, neutrality becomes obstruction." Bear's voice hardened. "This land is neutral by treaty, signed by Chief White Bull and ratified by your commanding officer. Colonel Harrison isn't here," Steele snapped. "I am." Behind him, one of the soldiers emerged from the barn carrying a blood-stained Comanche pouch. This was found near the bodies, Steele said, taking it from the soldier. It belonged to a soldier. Letters, a photo of his wife. Your Comanche guest took it as a trophy. Bear stared at the pouch. It was Comanche, but the beadwork was off. The pattern didn't match White Bull's tribe, not even close. "This isn't White Bull's," Bear said slowly. "I've seen their style. This is someone else's, maybe even faked." Steele stepped closer, lowering his voice to a threat. "You calling me a liar, Mallister? I'm saying." Bear replied carefully, you're hunting a wounded boy with half a story and a handful of lies." Steele's hand drifted toward his revolver. "That's enough." Just then a shout came from inside the cabin. "Lieutenant, fresh blood on the floor. Someone's treating a wound." Bear's heart stopped. The bedroom. Steele's smile came slow and cold. "Well, well, looks like your neutrality's wearing thin." Rifles were unslung. The soldiers began to converge on the cabin, moving like a trap closing in. Bear stepped in their path. "I wouldn't," he warned. Steele sneered. "Or what? You'll stop 10 armed men alone." "You won't be alone for long," Bear said quietly. Steele froze. Off in the distance, the war drums beat louder now. One rhythm, then two, then three. Running Wolf wasn't coming alone. "You hear that?" Bear asked. Steele glanced toward the horizon. "They wouldn't dare." "They would if they think you murdered Running Wolf's son." Steele hesitated. Another soldier approached, whispering in his ear. "Sir, multiple riders approaching. Fast, from 3 directions." Bear saw the panic in Steele's eyes before he could hide it. "Form a perimeter." Steele barked, prepared to defend. But Bear was already walking back toward the cabin. "Lieutenant," he called over his shoulder, "if you want to live through the next hour, you'll listen to me. We still have a chance to stop this, but only if you tell me the truth what really happened in Devil's Canyon." Steele didn't answer. Not yet. But Bear could see the fear flickering now. The war party was coming. And this wasn't about a fugitive anymore. It was about what they were all willing to kill and die for. Inside the cabin, the air had turned heavy with dread. Swift Eagle lay beneath thick blankets, his body barely stirring, breath shallow but steady. Bear had done everything he could to keep him alive, but the real danger wasn't the bleeding. It was the 10 armed soldiers circling outside like wolves waiting for permission to pounce. Lieutenant Steele was pacing now, jaw tight, fingers twitching near his sidearm. Something was unraveling inside him, and Bear could feel it. Steele turned on him suddenly. "That Comanche kid murdered 2 of my men. They were escorting medicine food supplies destined for the reservation. He killed them in cold blood, and now he's bleeding in your bed." Bear didn't flinch. "That's a convenient story. Clean. Heroic. But there's just one problem, Lieutenant." Steele narrowed his eyes. "What problem?" Bear pointed to the pouch Steele had retrieved earlier, the one supposedly taken from a dead soldier. "That's not from White Bull's tribe. I've seen enough Comanche craftsmanship to know. The beadwork, the pattern, even the stitching, it's wrong." Steele laughed dryly, but his voice was forced. "You're an expert in Comanche handbags now. I'm an expert in," People Bear said coldly, "and your story doesn't add up." Before Steele could answer, a soldier emerged from the cabin holding a blood-soaked shirt. "Still wet, sir," he said. "And there's more blood in the back room. Someone's treating serious wounds." Steele's eyes locked on Bear like a hound spotting prey. "So you are harboring him?" Bear stayed calm. "I'm treating a wounded man. There's a difference." Steele stepped closer, his voice turning low and venomous. "Don't play moral high ground with me. You think this is about honor. That boy killed Americans, and I'm not leaving here without him." "That boy is 19, Bear snapped. "And I've met him before. He's quiet, curious, smart, not the kind who murders men and steals from his own people." "He took that pouch as a trophy," Steele barked. "No," Bear said sharply. "That pouch was planted." The accusation hung in the air like a struck bell. The soldiers paused. Even Morrison Steele's second in command shifted uncomfortably. Steele's voice hardened. "You accusing me of fabricating evidence, Mr. Mallister, I'm saying." Bear said slowly, "You're hiding something. and your story keeps changing." At that moment, Morrison spoke up. "Lieutenant, maybe we should contact Colonel Harrison before this goes any further." Steele shot him a glare that could cut steel. "The only order that matters is mine. We're following blood and bodies, not politics." But the war drums outside were getting louder now, joined by the sound of approaching horses, dozens of them. Bear could hear the war cries of warriors carried on the wind. Running Wolf was coming, and he was not coming to talk. Bear's voice lowered, urgent. "Steele, you need to tell me the truth. Now. Because if those warriors get here and believe their chief's son was murdered and hidden by U.S. soldiers, we're not surviving the next 10 minutes." Steele's jaw clenched. But Bear pressed harder. "You said Swift Eagle attacked a wagon. Then you said it was a supply escort. Then a patrol. But your unit is small, Lieutenant. Too small for supply protection. Too light for a war party. So, what were you really doing in Devil's Canyon?" Steele looked like he was about to speak, then stopped. Behind them, another soldier called out riders from the east. 24, and more dust coming from the south. Bear took a step closer. What happened out there? What really happened? And then finally, Steele's wall cracked. "We weren't escorting supplies," he said, voice low, almost ashamed. "We were escorting a surveyor." Bear went still. A government man, Steele continued sent to mark new boundaries, reservation lines. He wasn't supposed to be there, but we had orders. Bear's stomach dropped. "You were marking land to steal it." "It wasn't like that," Steele muttered. "Swift Eagle came across us cutting marks into trees that were sacred to them." He got upset. "Tried to stop us." "So you shot him," Bear said. "No," Steele said, looking away. The surveyor panicked. "Drew first. Swift Eagle fought back. Killed him, and one of my men in the crossfire." Now the truth rang out like thunder in Bear's chest. Swift Eagle wasn't a killer, he was a protector. A witness. One the government couldn't afford to leave alive. Steele looked back at him, eyes hollow. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. But it had happened. And now Bear stood in the middle of it with a wounded boy inside, armed soldiers outside, and 1,000 Comanche warriors riding toward him with fire in their hearts. "I gave my word to both sides," Bear said softly. "And now, no matter what I do, someone's going to bleed." Steele didn't respond. He didn't have to, because in that moment they both heard it. The war drums stopped, and in the silence that followed, Bear could hear hundreds of hooves coming fast. There was no hiding the truth anymore, only surviving it. The truth had a smell to it, like blood and smoke, and old lies finally catching fire. Bear stood on his porch facing a storm that was about to break. Behind him, Swift Eagle lay unconscious, hidden beneath blankets stained with his own blood. In front of him, 10 soldiers bristled with weapons and nerves, the tight formation of men who knew they were outnumbered and worse out of time. And above them, all the war drums had stopped, but the silence they left behind was worse. Then came the hoofbeats' thunder rolling across the prairie. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Warriors were coming from 3 directions, coordinated and fast. They weren't just arriving, they were surrounding the ranch. Lieutenant Steele's bravado cracked as the sound grew louder. His voice dropped to a sharp whisper. "How many warriors does White Bull command?" 300 on a good day, Bear replied, eyes locked on the horizon. "But those aren't just his riders. I hear 3 drum lines. That means 3 tribes. Could be close to 1,000. Steele swore under his breath. One of his men began reloading his rifle with trembling hands. "They won't attack soldiers," Steele said more to himself than anyone else. "They will," Bear countered, if they think you murdered Running Wolf's son and tried to cover it up. The war cries echoed now, sharp rising over the hills like eagles screaming vengeance. And then they appeared painted faces, braided hair spears, raised rifles, strapped. The first wave rode in from the west, hooves pounding the dust. Behind them, another wave surged from the east, and on the southern rise more warriors formed a wall of muscle paint and righteous fury. At the front of the western riders sat Running Wolf high on his painted stallion war paint, slashed across his face, eyes glowing with the wrath of a father who believed his son was dead. Bear stepped off the porch, his hands raised. "Running Wolf," he called. "Your son is alive." The war party skidded to a halt. Weapons twitched, but none fired. Running Wolf dismounted, tomahawk in hand, and stalked toward Bear. "Where is he in my cabin?" Bear said. Wounded but alive. Steele stepped forward, face pale but still defiant. "He's a murderer." He attacked Silence Bear, barked louder than anyone expected. Steele's mouth closed. Swift Eagle didn't attack anyone, Bear said. He stumbled onto a government operation, an illegal one. He tried to stop men from marking sacred trees. He bled for it. And then your men came chasing him, not to arrest him, but to silence him. Running Wolf narrowed his eyes. "You have proof." Bear turned and gestured to the leather pouch one of the soldiers still held. That pouch, Bear said, was planted. Steele claimed it was taken from a dead soldier. Said it contained letters, a photograph. Claimed it was a trophy. But I know White Bull's tribe. I've seen their beadwork. That pouch doesn't match. It's not their style. The color palette, the stitch pattern, it belongs to someone else. Someone who wanted to make it look like a Comanche attack. Running Wolf took the pouch in his hands and examined it. His fingers moved slowly, then stopped. His face darkened. "This is not from our people," he confirmed. "It is imitation, crude, not sacred." Murmurs rose among the Comanche ranks. Steele's voice broke through. "Even if the pouch is fake, the attack was real. 2 of my men died. And what were they doing in Devil's Canyon?" Bear pressed. What was so important it required secrecy, Steele didn't answer. But someone else did. "Tell them," came the voice of Sergeant Morrison stepping out from behind the line of soldiers. Steele turned furious. "Sergeant, stand down." "No, Sir," Morrison said loud enough for both sides to hear. "I've stood by long enough. It's time they knew." The soldiers stiffened. The Comanche warriors fell silent. "We weren't escorting supplies," Morrison continued. "We were escorting a government surveyor. He was marking sacred Comanche ground for future boundary adjustments. Not medicine, not aid, just greed." The boy tried to stop them, and things turned violent. Morrison looked toward Running Wolf. The surveyor fired first. Swift Eagle fought back to protect what's sacred. Bear nodded. That's why he ran. Not because he was guilty, but because he was the only witness. A long silence followed. Then Running Wolf lifted his tomahawk. "My son was nearly murdered for protecting our ancestors. And these soldiers tried to bury the truth." The warriors raised their weapons. But Bear stepped forward again, placing himself between the two forces. "No blood can be spilled here," he said, voice strong. "This land is still neutral ground. Chief White Bull declared it so. And we honor that declaration, or we become the monsters we claim to fight." Running Wolf's eyes burned. But he did not strike. Then came a weak voice from the doorway. "Father." It was Swift Eagle, standing barely upright, his body trembling but his spirit unbroken. "I am not dead," he said, "and I do not want war. I want justice." And in that moment, Bear saw the tide shift. Truth had taken root, and war might just be postponed. The drums had stopped, but only to make way for something louder. Hoofbeats. Like thunder crashing across the plains, they rolled in from every direction. The hills trembled with the weight of hundreds of horses, each one bearing a warrior ready to avenge a son, a brother, a sacred land. 3 tribes, 3 war parties, and at the center of them all rode Running Wolf high on a black stallion, his face streaked in war paint eyes burning with grief and rage. He wasn't just leading an army. He was leading a reckoning. Bear stood in front of his cabin, arms raised, trying to speak through the storm. "This doesn't have to end in blood," he shouted, but his voice was nearly drowned by the war cries echoing off the canyon walls. Behind him, Swift Eagle leaned against the doorframe, bandaged weak but standing on his own. His presence alone was proof that the accusations were lies, that Steele had twisted the truth, that a sacred law had been broken not by the Comanche, but by the very men who now cowered behind rifles. Father Swift Eagle called out again. Running Wolf's gaze snapped toward his son. For a moment, something flickered in the chief's eyes, hope, confusion, a hesitation in the war-hardened lines of his face. Then Lieutenant Steele stepped forward, revolver-drawn rage boiling over. "This is madness. That savage is a killer. That land belongs to the United States." Before he could raise his weapon, Sergeant Morrison tackled him, knocking the gun from his hand and pinning him to the ground. "You've done enough," Sir Morrison growled. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, perjury, and attempted murder." The soldiers didn't move to help Steele. Bear could see it now. Their eyes were full of shame, not loyalty. Running Wolf approached tomahawk and hand-eyes locked on Steele. "He tried to kill my son, and he failed," Bear said quickly, stepping between them. "But if you kill him now, we lose everything. The truth must not die here." Running Wolf stopped breathing hard. Around them, warriors had their bows drawn, rifles aimed. The slightest twitch could spark a war that would set the entire territory on fire. "Give him to us," one warrior growled. "Let us make it right in blood." But Swift Eagle raised his voice. "No." The crowd quieted. "He does not deserve honor in death." Swift Eagle continued, voice steadier than anyone expected. "He deserves truth and justice." Running Wolf lowered his weapon slightly. He tried to erase our history, our burial grounds. He marked trees with government signs. Bear nodded, "And we can prove it." He reached into his satchel and pulled out the leather pouch, the one Steele had tried to use to frame Swift Eagle. From it spilled dozens of metal tags, each engraved with surveyor codes, government stamps, and GPS markers. Markers meant to redraw boundaries. Markers meant to erase treaties. Running Wolf's warriors stepped forward, looking at the tags like they were bones dug up from their ancestors' graves. "These are not just survey markers," Bear said. "They are evidence, proof of a plan to steal every sacred place your people ever honored." Running Wolf turned to his warriors and spoke in Comanche. His words were sharp, powerful. The warriors began to murmur, lowering their weapons inch by inch. "This is bigger than one man," Bear said to the gathering. "If we kill Steele here, it ends in blood and more blood. But if we carry this proof to the governor, to the courts, the world will finally see what was done in the shadows." Steele, still pinned beneath Morrison's knee, sneered. "You think the governor cares about a bunch of trees and beads? He will," Morrison said, "when the press gets involved. When the courts see these tags, when a rancher and a Comanche warrior stand side by side and testify." Running Wolf stared at Bear. "And you would do this, I already have," Bear said. "I broke sacred law to save your son. Now let me break silence to save your people." A long, tense beat passed. Then Running Wolf stepped back and raised a hand. The war drums ceased. Bows lowered. Rifles dropped. The air shifted. Not peace, but something close. Hope. Swift Eagle collapsed to his knees exhausted, and Bear rushed to steady him. Running Wolf helped lift his son, whispering something in Comanche that made the young man smile through the pain. Then the chief turned back to Bear. "You have spoken like a warrior," he said. "Now ride like one." Bear nodded, because the real war was just beginning, and this time it would be fought not with bullets, but with truth. Truth, when it finally comes, doesn't whisper, it roars like a storm breaking across the plains. Sergeant Morrison still had Lieutenant Steele pinned to the ground, dust rising around them like smoke from a battlefield. The war drums had gone silent, but the air was thick with tension. Comanche warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes blazing. Soldiers stood rigid, unsure whether to aim their weapons or drop them. And Bear Mallister stood in the center, half rancher, half bridge, between worlds, watching a reckoning unfold. "Speak," Running Wolf commanded, his voice like flint. Morrison rose slowly from Steele's back eyes, never leaving the man he'd once called his superior. "It's time they knew," the sergeant said loud enough for everyone, tribesmen, soldiers, and ghosts to hear. "All of it." He looked at Bear, then Swift Eagle, then back at the circle of warriors surrounding them. For 6 months, Lieutenant Steele has been taking bribes from government surveyors and land speculators, escorting them into protected territory, Comanche land, to map it out for seizure. Quietly, illegally. A murmur swept through the crowd. Steele tried to rise, but Morrison shoved him down again. "You ordered us to lie. You told families their sons died in Apache raids, but they didn't. They were ambushed and killed because they were marking trees they had no right to touch." Bear stepped forward. What were they marking? Land trails. Morrison shook his head grimly. Worse, burial grounds, sacred sites. They were cutting symbols into trees around the Comanches' dead, using them as reference points for potential gold claims. Running Wolf's face hardened into something colder than war, a slow, ancient fury. "Gold," he repeated. "They desecrated our ancestors' resting places." For gold, Morrison nodded. There have been rumors for years. Traces of gold in the hills. The government didn't want a treaty standing in the way if it turned out to be true. So they sent Steele to soften the ground quietly, methodically, and without any public record. Bear felt sick. That's why Swift Eagle was shot. He stumbled onto something too big to survive. He didn't kill anyone, Morrison said firmly. The surveyor fired first. Swift Eagle defended himself. Steele told us to say otherwise. A young Comanche warrior held up one of the surveyor's markers from the leather pouch, thin metal tags engraved with coordinates and reference codes. "How many of these sites have been touched?" Morrison glanced at Steele, then answered. "At least a dozen that I know of. Maybe more." Running Wolf turned slowly in place, addressing his warriors in Comanche. His voice was quiet but sharp, slicing through the dust and disbelief. As he spoke, some warriors dropped to one knee. Others lowered their weapons in reverence. All understood the depth of the violation. This wasn't just about theft. It was sacrilege. Swift Eagle, still weak, leaned on Bear's shoulder. His voice was soft, but his words carried weight. They weren't just marking trees, he said. They were drawing lines over our stories, our spirits, our bones. A silence fell over the ranch yard that felt like mourning. Then Bear stepped forward, holding up the pouch again. "These tags," he said, "are more powerful than any weapon. They're proof, cold, metallic proof that the government broke its promises, and that a young warrior almost died for trying to protect what couldn't be replaced. Steele groaned on the ground. You don't understand what this land means. That gold could feed thousands, build railroads, schools. No bear said. It would build graves. Running Wolf approached, tomahawk in hand, not raised but carried like a judge's gavel. You see prophet, the chief said. We see bones, you see hills, we see history, and for that your blood should stain this dirt. Morrison stepped between them. Let him live, let him face trial. Not in a Comanche circle, not in a cavalry court, but in front of the people, white and native alike. Let everyone see what he did. Let the lies burn in public. Bear nodded. There's more power in truth than vengeance. Running Wolf stared at them both, then at his son, who gave a faint, tired nod. Finally, the chief lowered his weapon. Very well, he said, but let justice move faster than the lies did. Then, from the shadows of the crowd, another soldier stepped forward with something in his hand, a leather-bound journal. We found this in the surveyor's wagon, he said. It has names, locations, payments, and something else. He handed it to Bear, who opened it slowly. Inside were sketches of burial trees and notations. Gold vein, likely sacred marker removed. Site viable. Bear closed the book with a quiet fury. It was all there. Names, maps, intent. This wasn't rogue greed. This was organized betrayal. He looked at Running Wolf. We have everything we need. The chief nodded. Then take it to those who pretend to lead your people. And if they refuse to act, Bear asked. Running Wolf's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. Then the drums will return. Even in a place soaked with betrayal and on the edge of war, justice still had a voice, and that voice came from a wounded boy. Swift Eagle stood near the cabin door, leaning heavily on Bear's arm, his bandages soaked with blood, but his eyes clear and defiant. Around him stood 100 armed warriors, still ready to spill blood for honor, for grief, for justice. But Swift Eagle raised his voice and silenced them all. My father, he said, turning to Running Wolf, we have shown the truth. The white man Bear risked his life to protect me, even knowing it could cost him his own. The soldiers who followed Steele, they did not know what they were protecting. Only their orders. Running Wolf watched his son carefully. What are you saying? Swift Eagle took a breath that clearly hurt him. I say we give the guilty a choice. The words rippled through the air. Bear turned surprised. I say, Swift Eagle continued louder now that they choose their judgment. Comanche trial by combat or white man's justice with our people watching to ensure it is not just another lie in uniform. It was a radical proposal unheard of on either side of the line, but it caught the wind like a spark in dry grass. Morrison stepped forward. I'll stand for a real trial. Public. Witnesses from both sides. That's the justice I signed up to serve. A murmur passed through the line of soldiers. None moved to object, but Steele, kneeling in the dust blood on his lip and hate in his eyes, spat at the ground. I will not stand trial before savages, he growled, and I'll die before I let them judge me. Running Wolf's face hardened. Then so be it. He turned to Bear. He chooses death, the chief said, and by our law he must face it like a warrior. Bear's stomach dropped. Trial by combat, a chance Running Wolf replied to fight for his innocence with his own hands. It is our oldest law, and he invoked it. The warriors cleared a circle in the yard. No words, no chants, just silence and the sound of boots and moccasins scraping dirt. Steele was handed a knife. His opponent, a Comanche warrior named Gray Hawk, known for both mercy and precision, stepped into the ring, bare-chested, calm, and ready. Bear looked away. It was over in less than 3 minutes. Steele rushed in with rage and no skill. Gray Hawk dodged, parried, and with a swift strike disarmed and dropped him. Another second, and Steele was on the ground, his lifeblood soaking into the dust he'd tried to steal. Running Wolf said nothing. Neither did his men. There was no triumph in the death of a man who had already lost everything. But there was peace in finality. As Steele's body was carried away, Bear approached Morrison still holding the leather pouch and the surveyor's journal filled with damning evidence. "You need to take this to the Capitol," Bear said. "Every name, every map, every lie, expose it all." Morrison nodded. "I will, but they'll try to bury it. There's money behind all this gold land power." "Then I'll ride with you," Bear said. "They might ignore a soldier, but they won't ignore a rancher standing beside a Comanche warrior." Running Wolf stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "You saved my son's life, Bear Mallister. You stood between us and war. Now we ask one more thing of you." Bear met his eyes. "Name it. Be our witness. Be our voice in a world that would rather silence us." "I will," Bear said, no hesitation. Swift Eagle smiled despite the pain. "Then maybe this land isn't lost after all." They rode the next morning, Bear, Morrison, Swift Eagle, and 2 warriors as escort. The evidence they carried would shake the foundations of the Capitol. Within weeks, hearings were held. Officials were named. Survey operations were halted. 17 government agents, including land speculators and Army contacts, were indicted. But more important than any headline was what happened back at Bear's ranch. It didn't return to normal. It became something better, a place where Comanche and settler children learned side by side, where treaties weren't just ink on paper but lived in shared soil, where justice didn't belong to one flag or one people, but to truth. And every October, on the anniversary of the Day War, was avoided by the courage of a few. An eagle feather was left on Bear's doorstep, a silent symbol, a promise kept. When truth is unearthed, it doesn't always bring justice. Sometimes it reveals just how far the rot goes. Lieutenant Steele's death should have ended it. Trial by combat witnessed by both sides had brought closure. But as Bear Mallister held the bloodied journal recovered from the surveyor's wagon, its pages full of names, coordinates, and transactions, he realized something chilling. Steele had never been the architect. He was just a cog in a machine much larger and far more dangerous. The journal was meticulous coded entries for bribes, paid land boundaries falsified, and the locations of Comanche burial sites flagged for future exploitation. Many entries were initialed, some with military ranks, others with government department codes, and even a few with the names of prominent land speculators. This wasn't a rogue operation, Bear said aloud as he read through the entries by lantern light in the quiet of his cabin. It was sanctioned, funded, protected. Swift Eagle sat nearby, still recovering but alert. How many knew, he asked. Too many, Bear replied. Some in Washington, maybe even the territorial governor. This wasn't just about gold, it was about erasing the treaties, all of them. The plan had been brilliant in its cruelty-marked sacred lands as unused, redraw boundaries quietly and flood the area with settlers and investors before the tribes could respond. Surveyors had been sent under military protection. Any resistance was labeled hostile activity. Anyone who fought back was branded a savage. And then came the final step: destroy the evidence, which is exactly why Steele had hunted Swift Eagle so relentlessly. The boy had stumbled into the truth and lived to escape it. Steele was their broom, Morrison said bitterly, sent to sweep away the pieces. Bear nodded. But we have the dust now, and the dust speaks. They gathered everything: maps, survey tags, forged documents the pouch Steele had tried to pass off as Comanche craftsmanship. The goal was no longer survival. It was exposure. Running Wolf joined them that night by the fire, his expression unreadable. "I've seen empires fall for less than what they've done here," he said. "You take this to your leaders. You tell them the drums will remain silent only if the truth is heard." But Bear knew the risks. What they carried was radioactive. Evidence not just of theft, but of state-sanctioned betrayal. If the wrong people got to it first, it would vanish into fire, or worse, twist into a new lie. And yet the path was clear. "This isn't about one tribe," Bear said. "This is about all of them: Apache, Kiowa, Comanche, and others. If this goes public, it won't just be a scandal, it'll force the nation to decide who it wants to be." Morrison agreed to lead the military report. Swift Eagle, against everyone's advice, vowed to testify in person. And Bear, once just a rancher trying to live between two worlds, became something else entirely: a bridge, a fire starter, a threat to silence. As the sun rose over the dry Texas plains, Bear looked out toward the hills that had nearly become a battlefield, and thought of what had been avoided and what still had to come. The government wouldn't go down easy, but now they had the one thing even corrupt power fears: truth, with witnesses. 3 weeks later, Bear stood in a courtroom in Austin with tribal elders in full regalia, sitting shoulder to shoulder with Army officers and journalists scribbling every word. When he held up the journal and read the first name aloud, a hush fell across the room like thunder before the strike. One by one, the pieces fell. Investigations began. Senators issued statements. Protests erupted in front of the Capitol. Within months, 17 federal and territorial officials were indicted. The illegal land survey program was dismantled. The treaty system, long a paper illusion, was dragged back into the light and forced to be honored. But it wasn't victory. It was vigilance. Back at Bear's ranch, the land once marked for theft now held markers of a different kind: granite stones etched with the names of sacred places once nearly lost. Children from both worlds came to learn about them, to touch the soil that had almost been erased. Running Wolf visited only once after the trials ended. He didn't speak much, just stared at the horizon, then handed Bear a single eagle feather. "This time we made them listen," he said. Bear nodded. "Next time they won't forget." The drums were silent now, but not forgotten. They waited like thunder beyond the mountains, ready to return if justice failed. Bear Mallister stood at the edge of his porch, holding the worn leather pouch in one hand and the damning surveyor's journal in the other. Inside were coordinates, signatures, proof of bribes, boundary violations, and sacred desecrations. In his hands he carried the truth. But truth alone wasn't enough. It needed a voice. Across the yard, Running Wolf stood beside his horse arms, folded his gaze fixed on Bear, like a man measuring the weight of history. "You know what happens if we do nothing," the chief said. Bear nodded. "War. And if you carry these lies to your governor and they laugh, ignore, or bury it," Running Wolf pressed. "Still war," Bear admitted quietly. "Then this is your choice: Bear Mallister." Running Wolf stepped forward, his voice low but heavy as iron. "Take this truth to the Capitol. Let them hear it from your mouth. a white man's mouth, because mine will be silenced before it reaches their ears. You go as a witness, or we go as warriors." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of distant rain. It would have been easier, Bear thought, to let war come, to let fury speak, but he had seen what war cost on both sides: broken families, burned fields, children who never grew old. "I'm just a rancher," Bear said. No Swift Eagle replied from the doorway behind him, still wrapped in bandages but standing tall. "You are the bridge. You've been that since the first day you opened your land to peace." Bear looked down at the journal, thumbed through the pages of betrayal and greed. Then he looked back toward the horizon, toward Austin, the seat of power where men signed treaties with one hand and broke them with the other. "If I ride," Bear said slowly, "I can't promise they'll listen." "They don't have to," Running Wolf said. "They just have to be seen, and when you speak, you do not go alone." From behind the gathered warriors, 3 tribal elders stepped forward, offering Bear a ceremonial staff wrapped in deerskin adorned with eagle feathers and the beadwork of 3 tribes. With this, one elder said, "You ride not as a settler, but as our messenger." Bear took the staff in both hands. It was heavier than it looked, not in weight, but in meaning. He strapped the journal and pouch to his saddle. Morrison approached and handed him a folded letter already signed by every soldier who had seen the truth. "You've got our names," Morrison said, "our testimonies, and if they don't believe you, we'll make them." Swift Eagle offered a final word before Bear mounted. "If you fail, we fight, but if you succeed, maybe this land won't bleed again." Bear rode out that afternoon, not as a rancher, not as a politician, not even as a hero, but as a living witness, a man carrying a flame into a room full of shadows. The journey to Austin was long, filled with sleepless nights and suspicious eyes. He was followed once, nearly ambushed twice, but he made it. And when he stood before the governor's council, he did not beg. He spoke. He told them about the gold, the surveys, the sacred trees, the burial grounds marked for removal. He handed them the names, the maps, the forged signatures. He laid out the markers across their marble table like bullets, except these could kill silence. When they tried to deny it, Morrison stepped forward. When they tried to delay, Swift Eagle entered the chamber on crutches and stared down every man in the room. And when they tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, Bear said only this: "If you will not protect the treaty, then you will face the war that follows its betrayal." The room went quiet, and, for once, they listened. Weeks later, federal agents swept through the offices of land speculators and corrupt officers. Investigations were launched, charges filed, treaties re-examined. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Back in the plains, the war drums were replaced with something else, the steady hammer of rebuilding. Bear's Ranch became more than neutral ground. It became a meeting place, a school, a symbol. And every year on the day he made that ride, Bear would find 3 feathers at his door, one for each tribe that believed in his word. Because sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a rifle or a blade. It's a man willing to carry truth into the heart of power and survive. The governor's chamber was silent as Bear stood alone before a sea of skeptical officials, ranch barons, and federal agents. His presence, a native man wrapped not in war paint but in dignity, was already rewriting what they thought they knew. In his hands he carries a satchel of truth, the hidden letters, the forged maps, and the names of every man who had stolen land and life from his people. The governor, once dismissive, now leans forward. "You say you witnessed this with your own eyes?" Bear's voice was steady. "I didn't just witness it, I survived it, and I carried the blood of both worlds." Gasps followed as he laid out each document one by one like weapons in a quiet war. Names trembled on pages, seals cracked. The truth was denied. 17 men, federal agents, local sheriffs, wealthy landowners were indicted. Some were dragged from their homes in shame. Others tried to flee only to be captured by their own guilt. The governor, now humbled, signed orders to halt illegal land seizures and reopen treaty negotiations with tribal leaders. The stolen land wasn't just soil, it was identity, spirit, ancestry. And now, for the first time in decades, it will be honorable again. Bear didn't return to war. He returned to his people not as a warrior, but as something far rarer, a living bridge. He stood beneath the wide sky between two nations, no longer torn in two, but whole, carrying the weight of what had been lost and the hope of what might yet be saved. The newspapers called him the man who turned the tide. Children in both worlds learned his name, not like a soldier, not as a trainer, but like a truth-teller. Elders in his village bless him with the white feather of peace. The U.S. Marshals gave him a silver star, not as a lawman, but as a symbol that justice, when chosen with courage, can cross borders and bloodlines. Years passed, but his story only grew. Where once stood monuments of conquest, now rose plaques honoring those who chose mercy. And in quiet classrooms the name Bear was taught with reverence, not fear. He never asked for legacy. He only wanted peace. But in choosing truth over silence and justice over vengeance, Bear became a man both sides could finally believe in. The fires of conflict had faded, but the memory of what nearly happened still burned in every heart that lived through it. History often turns on the actions of armies of generals and kings, but sometimes it shifts because one person refuses to stay silent. Bear was not a soldier in the traditional sense. He carried no flag. He commanded no army. What he carried was heavier than any weapon, truth born from pain, and the will to speak it when the world preferred silence. In a land where blood had stained the soil for generations, Bear proved that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it comes quietly in the form of a choice to stand when others kneel, to speak when it's dangerous, to reach out instead of strike back. His decision to walk into the halls of power with evidence, not revenge, changed everything. Treaties were redrawn. Children who once knew only fear began to dream of peace. And two peoples, long divided by betrayal, began to speak across that chasm for the first time in a lifetime. But more than laws or lines on a map, Bear left behind a deeper legacy, one that lived in the hearts of those who listened. He reminded them that justice isn't born in courts or capitals. It begins in the small, trembling place inside a man where he decides who he will be, no matter who hurt him, no matter what it costs. He showed that honesty, even when inconvenient, is more powerful than violence. That peace, though fragile, is worth more than all the victories carved in stone. That love for your people doesn't mean hatred for another's, and that no history is beyond redemption if even one person dares to write a different ending. Bear was never crowned or celebrated in the ways the world usually remembers heroes, but his impact ran deeper than statues or medals. It lived in the way people now greeted one another without fear, in the letters exchanged between communities once sworn to hate, in the shared harvests on land once soaked in tears. Years later, as elders passed his story to the next generation, they didn't speak of him as a warrior or prophet. They spoke of him as a man who chose wisely when it mattered most. And that became the lesson carried forward, that, in every age, peace begins with a person who chooses to do the right thing, especially when it's the hardest thing to do.